Okay, I am John Butte, and my wife Carmen is here today with us. And Carmen and I are the proud, if ever so humble, owners of a 1926 Model T touring car that was nicknamed the Silver Streak. And the car is in the museum, and if you haven't seen it already, I hope you stop in and take a look at this car. It's a Model T. It looks a lot different because it has never been restored. At least the exterior hasn't been restored, and it shows all of the wear and tear of a number of trips in it. And that's really what the story is about, and I'm happy to be here. I know they say every Model T has its own story, and I'm just happy to have a chance to share my story with you. And the story is a lot more about the women. Hey, this is a girl's story. It's a lot more about the women who took summer vacations in this car than it is about the car itself. The car simply was the mode of transportation that they used, and the girls lovingly referred to it as Silver Streak. So the story begins in Bradford, Illinois, a small farming town where Darlene graduated from high school in 1930, wanted to go to college, but her father just didn't think a girl needed to go to college in 1930, and so he bribed her. He said, if you'll go to beauty school and stay here in town, I'll pay for beauty school and I'll buy you a car. And that was probably the worst bribe that her father ever pulled off, because what Darlene did was immediately start organizing summer vacations with her friends, and they would hop in the Model T and travel across the United States and Canada and even a visit to Mexico. The first trip would be in 1934, and they would go for 9 consecutive summers somewhere in the United States. 71,000 miles is what they claim to have put on the car on those trips. The first trip being in 1934, a simple camping trip to Devil's Lake, Wisconsin. Now, is there anyone here who knows where Devil's Lake, Wisconsin is? Okay. All right. Well, that first trip was one that they really enjoyed and remembered. There were 5 girls that went in the car on that trip. They loved camping at Devil's Lake, but it wasn't common for a bunch of girls in 1934 to be out on a camping trip. However, it was common for a bunch of boys to be out on camping trips at Devil's Lake in 1934. And the girls really enjoyed their time at Devil's Lake. Now, Darlene had laid down some rules early on that served the girls well. There was no drinking, and there was no smoking. She didn't allow the girls to drink or smoke while they were on the tour together. And she laid down the rule that there would be no pairing off and dating. And this was an era of big band music, and the girls loved to dance. And so they would pitch a tent at Devil's Lake, and then they'd go looking for a dance hall and dance the night away, but they would all get back in the Silver Streak and head back to the campground for the night. 1935 trip, a short trip to White Pines State Park in Illinois. I don't know whether anyone knows White Pines. Yes, and the trip was almost a disaster from the beginning, as the girls tell the story. It rained terribly hard, and they were only going to be gone for a weekend. And on the way back, or as they got ready to leave to come back, the electrical system on that Model T wouldn't work. They got it started, but they had no lights. And Harriet Hooker and Claire Breen laid on the front fenders with flashlights and told Darlene, go left, go right, as they headed down the highway back to Bradford, Illinois. Two other girls were on the back and had white towels ready to wave if a car came up behind them and didn't see the Model T. Well, 1936, and with each year, it seemed as though Darlene, and she was the driving force, Darlene wanted to venture out further away from Bradford, Illinois and Stark County. And so in 1936, they planned a trip to go camping in Michigan, then take a car ferry across Lake Michigan, and of course, go back to Devil's Lake, Wisconsin. It was a wonderful trip. They had a grand time on the trip. When they left Bradford, though, this was the first time that Darlene had 6 people in the car. 6 girls, not 5. And when you go in and look at the car, you tell me, where did 6 girls fit in that car? But as they left with all of their luggage and their tent and camping gear, they made it about 6 miles and they couldn't pull the hill. So they stopped at Mrs. Berry's house and unloaded part of their luggage. They went another 8 miles to the community of Butte, Illinois, and they unloaded some more luggage because there was another hill that they had a hard time making. So a lot of their travels were trial and error, and they were learning a lot about life on the road in a Model T. 1937, and now Darlene is getting very bold. She wants to cross the border into Canada and go to Callander, Ontario to see a phenomenon that had been sweeping the world, the story of the Dion quintuplets. Anyone here know the story of, yes, yeah, there's hands going up. 5 identical little girls, a natural childbirth, and a famous doctor, Dr. Alan Roy Defoe, who was able to keep the babies alive and the mother alive in those early hours, and they all lived. People from around the world were flocking to Callander, Ontario, and Darlene didn't see any reason why 6 girls from Bradford, Illinois couldn't go to Callander, Ontario and see the Dion quintuplets, and so off they went. And they had a wonderful time. My Aunt Eleanor, my dad's sister, went on that trip. She had also gone on the 1936 trip. They had a wonderful time, and there's a lot to the story, but as they came back, they went around the north side of Lake Huron to Sault Ste. Marie, Canada. The last 250 miles were dirt roads. They ate dust for 250 miles, and that's a long time in a Model T. The top was down, and their eyes were caked with dust, and their throats were parched. They got into Sault Ste. Marie late at night. A policeman stopped them and talked to them and said, look, there's nobody in our jail tonight. Why don't you spend the night in the jail? We have showers and nice soft mattresses. So the girls spent that night in the jail in Sault Ste. Marie, Canada, and then went on and spent some time at Devil's Lake before going home. Now that trip bothered Darlene a lot. She was taking her vacation time from being a hairdresser, and all that last 250 miles was terrible. So the next year they decided to just go back to Devil's Lake, Wisconsin. And they'd been there a week when they ran into some boys who looked at their car and said, do you realize that Henry Ford, the man that invented that car, is celebrating a birthday this weekend, and there's a big party for him in Dearborn, Michigan? Well, that's all it took. Darlene called the girls together around the campsite and said, we're breaking camp in the morning, and we're going to go to Dearborn, Michigan, and wish that bigwig a happy birthday. We know that because one of the women that went on that trip, Winnie, is still alive today. And Carmen and I have interviewed her, and she told the story that they tried to convince Darlene not to do that, but she would have it no other way. They were going to go visit Henry Ford on his birthday. And away they went that next morning. I want to stop and just interject a couple of things that most people here probably know about Model Ts. But Winnie is a joy to talk to, and I didn't know a lot about Model Ts at first, and so when she came to our house to see the Model T when we first bought it, I took her out to the garage and I opened the door on the Model T and I said, Winnie, would you like to get in the car? Now, if you're a Model T person, you know there's no trunk on the car and you carry all of your luggage on the running boards, okay? So I opened the car, Winnie looked at me and said, John, this will be the first time I ever got in the car through the door. All of the other times, the girls had to climb over the side to get into the car. I also asked her, how fast did you guys go in that car with 6 girls and all of your luggage? And she said, well, we did about 35 miles an hour. I knew the car didn't have a speedometer, so I just asked, well, how did you know you were doing 35 miles an hour? And she said, oh, that was simple. Whenever a car would pass us, we'd yell out, how fast are we going? And they'd look down at their speedometer, 35 miles an hour, they would tell us. That 1938 trip, they went back to Devil's Lake, but then from there they went on, they ended up at the Ford plant, the gates were locked, they shut the car off, and wondered how are we going to get in to see Mr. Ford. And just then, a man by the name of Ray Dallinger, who was one of Henry's closest confidants at the time, drove by, saw the car, asked the girls if they needed help, and they simply said, well, no, but we're from Bradford, Illinois, and we want to wish Henry Ford a happy birthday. Ray unlocked the gate, ushered them through. Later that day, they had a private lunch with Henry Ford. The car was taken out and tuned up a little bit, and they spent a night in one of the houses in Greenfield Village at Henry's bequest. It was called the Mill House at the time, and they had just had a wonderful time and an unbelievable experience meeting Henry Ford in 1938. They would carry on a 5-year correspondence with Henry after that. Henry sent pictures to them in Illinois, and Darlene wrote back to him thanking him for the pictures. And all of her letters to him began, friend Mr. Ford. Not dear Henry, not Henry, friend Mr. Ford. Well, when they had lunch with him, he explained that he was going to have a big exhibit at the New York World's Fair in 1939. Darlene was quick on the uptake here. She decided that in 1939, the girls would go to the New York World's Fair. And that's exactly what they did. My mother went on that trip in 1939. They dropped by Dearborn on their way out, hoping to see Henry before they got to the fair. They knew what day he was going to be at the fair because they had been corresponding. The crowds were so large, though, that they couldn't make eye contact with him, and they didn't see him at the fair. But a famous picture was taken of them, and it's really on the cover of the book, and it's got his signature and the signature of all of the girls that were on that trip, including my mother. They would go on to Washington, D.C. They would come back through Dayton, Ohio, and turn north and decide one more time that they were going to try and see Henry up in Dearborn. So they drove from Dayton to Dearborn, missed him again. So they missed him 3 times on that trip. 1940, they would go to California, the longest of all of the trips, the most adventurous of all of the trips. They would have car trouble along the way, starting in Oklahoma when the petcock on the lower petcock didn't get closed and they lost oil for the next 150 miles and had bearing problems. But they made it to Los Angeles and they went to 20th Century Studios. They had a pass, they got into the commissary, met all kinds of movie stars, including Don Amici and Bill Bojangles Robinson, the famous tap dancer from the Shirley Temple movies. Had a grand time, moved on to San Francisco, where the Golden Gate exhibition was going on. And what motor company do you think had an exhibit at the Golden Gate exhibition? Ford Motor Company. Well, 75 miles outside of San Francisco, the engine problem got to the point that they had a major failure, and they had to be towed into San Francisco. 75 miles, 10 cents a mile, a $7.50 towing fee. They were late getting to the fair when they explained what had happened to the officials at the Ford facility, at the Ford exhibit. The Ford people went and got the car, took it to the Richmond, California Ford plant and overhauled the engine and put in a new crankshaft so that the girls could get home. All of that on Henry's nickel, because he had told the people, take care of the girls while they're here. And so they did. They took care of them. On their way back, they'd come through Lincoln, Nebraska, and one of the girls had a teaching contract, and they were delayed because of the engine overhaul, and she wasn't sure that she was going to get back in time to meet the requirements of her teaching contract. And so they put her on a train in Lincoln to get her back to Chicago in plenty of time to make that contract. 1941, they actually wrote to Henry about going to Alaska and wondered if he had agents on that new highway that was built. Well, the Alcan Highway wasn't finished yet, so they never went to Alaska. They went south instead to New Orleans and across through Atlanta to Washington, D.C. and back. They visited 4 military bases. Now, this is 1941, but the United States has not yet entered the war. But many young men had been drafted, and they were in military camps. And so they stopped to see many boys from home that were in 4 different camps. Incidentally, they were at Henry's birthday party, I guess, in 1938. They sent him a telegram on his 39th birthday from New York, even though they missed him. On the 40 trip, they sent him a telegram wishing him a happy birthday from San Francisco. And on the 41 trip, they sent him a telegram from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where they were visiting a military base, wishing him, again, a happy birthday. On that 1941 trip, a funny story in Atlanta, they'd been on the road several days. They needed to get some laundry done. And someone said, well, you can just take it to a hotel and they'll probably do it for you. And so they did. And when they went to pick it up, the bill was $27.34. And it was breaking them. They didn't have any money. They needed gas money. And they were sitting in the car just wondering what they were going to do. And as the crowd gathered around them, one man took off his hat and started passing it around the crowd. It went around once and they didn't have $27.34, so they passed it around again, and they got the money to take care of their laundry bill. They would see Henry for a second time in Dearborn on that trip in 1941, and he put them up in a place that was called the Clinton Inn, and it's now called the Eagle Tavern. So they stayed there at his insistence. 1942 would be the last trip. The war had started. They weren't even sure they'd go on a trip. Tires were rationed and fuel was rationed. But they went on a trip again to Michigan and to Wisconsin. And the funny story on this trip is Jean Turnbull went on this trip. It was the only trip she went on. And she and her husband-to-be, were planning their wedding. And so she would stop every now and then and get on a telephone and call to talk to her fiancé. And finally, they found the date that would work, but Jean's mom told her she needed to get home and help clean the house and buy a dress if they were going to get married at the house. And so she had to be taken to a train station so she could get home and the rest of the girls finish the trip. When my mom passed away, I began to wonder whatever happened to that car. And I began searching for it, and I found it eventually on the internet out in Portland, Oregon. And I found out that Darlene's daughter still owned it, but that she was interested in selling the car. And so with the good graces of my wife and her willingness, I decided to make an offer and buy the car, and we brought it back to Illinois in early 2012. The girls had 3 reunions. You know, you talk a lot about Model Ts. The memories are made on the road. And I was able to come across 3 diaries that helped me write the book. And these girls had lots of wonderful memories. They had a reunion in 1964, and the restaurant that they chose for the reunion almost kicked them out because they were laughing so hard as they read passages from their diaries and told stories about their trips. They'd have another reunion in '72 and the last reunion in '82. Well, that's kind of the story, and I do wish that you would all have a chance to go in and take a look at the car. Tell me where 6 girls sat on it on those trips. I will entertain any questions that you have, and then I'll also be available to sign books in by the Silver Streak. So, any questions?
Have you had the Silver Streak running?
The question is, have I had the Silver Streak running? Yes, it runs, and every year since we've gotten it back in Illinois, we've had the car in the Bradford Labor Day Parade. And Winnie is now 100, and Jean is 99, and they've ridden in the car with us since 2012, and they sit in the back and throw candy out. And I'm sure they have a chiropractor appointment the next day. But we have a lot of fun with them, and so it runs, but I would be lucky to say that I put a mile or 2 on it every year, not many miles. Any other questions? Well, yes. Do we have any trips planned? We don't have any trips planned for it right now. I must tell you that last year, my wife and I took it in the trailer, and we followed the route of the 1939 trip my mom was on, up through Michigan and across Ontario and Quebec, as far as Quebec City, and then came back. And we stopped in several locations and made presentations and showed the car. It was a lot of fun, and we want to do that on some other trips. Did anybody remember? No. You know, most of the people that would remember would probably have been very young children at the time, but no one remembered. But I had slides, and some of the locations, historical societies showed me the same location today. Incidentally, the girls didn't sleep in just one jail, they slept in 3 jails, and one of them was Dorval, Quebec. And they took me and they showed me the brick wall, which is part of the municipal building today, and you could see exactly the door to the police station that was there back then. Yes? I didn't. Yes, on the 1939 trip that my mom was on, the girls they left Washington, D.C., and they were headed back, and actually, as I said, came to Dayton, Ohio. But as they were going through the mountains, they were going up a long grade, and cars got backed up behind them. And when they got to the top, they pulled off to the side, and many cars went by, and there were a lot of upset people, and finally a car hauler truck, an empty car hauler truck, pulled by and pulled over in front of the girls. And the man got out and he came back and he said, "Oh, I just need to apologize to you girls." And they thought, why is he apologizing? And he said, "I've been calling you every name in the book since I started up this mountain because they were so slow in getting up the hill." But as they talked, he asked where they were going, and he said, "That's right on my route. That's right the direction I'm headed." And so he said, "We're going to put your car on my empty car hauling trailer, and I'm going to take you that far." And so they did. They loaded the car on the back, and the girls sat in the car on this car hauling trailer and waved at the cars that went by as they went on down the road. And that story is in the book. It's also, my mom's told that story, and the audio tape is on, I have a website for the book story, so it's on that website. Thanks. Well, we took our 26 Model T out and toured with the group here and had a wonderful time. But yesterday, I got to feel and experience that same thing when our black 26 Model T, which we named Regina after my mother, couldn't make it up the hill, one of the hills, and so my passengers had to get out of the car so that I could get up the hill and they could get back in the car at the top of the hill. Listen, you've been a great audience, and I don't want to take... Oh, question. How long is the car going to be in the museum? Until about the middle of August, when we will take it back to Illinois and prepare it for the Labor Day parade. Yeah. Yes.
Do you ever know anything about the bright red upholstery when that was done?
But when was the bright red upholstery put on the inside? That was for the '82 reunion that the girls had, and they put it in the Bradford Labor Day parade. But the car had not been stored very well, and the seats had all deteriorated. And so, in preparation for that parade, Darlene, actually, who was living in California, had her sister take it out and get that taken care of and get it running, because it hadn't run in many years. Darlene was an amazing woman, and I'll close on this. She moved to California and got married to a contractor who was building houses. And as you know, contracting business has its peaks and valleys. And in one of those valleys, when they had two daughters, he couldn't find enough work. And he was very worried that he couldn't feed his family. And what did Darlene do? Well, her father had run an ice cream parlor back in Illinois, and she was looking through the newspaper, and she found this opportunity to buy or franchise an ice cream parlor. So she answered the ad, and Darlene would become one of the first female franchise owners of Baskin-Robbins. So you put an obstacle in her way, and she figured out how to do something with that, and she actually owned 2 Baskin-Robbins franchises.
Did I hear that the Silver Streak went to Hollywood recently?
Yes, the Silver Streak was in Hollywood in February. We were on a new program on the Discovery Channel called Sticker Shock. And we were in the first episode, so they came and got the car out of the museum, thanks to Jerry and others who helped load the car for them in the snow, took it to Los Angeles. Carmen and I flew to Los Angeles, taped the show, and then came back, and it was the premiere episode in April 30th, I think. It was a neat experience, a lot of fun. Okay, yes. Well, again, thank you very much, and we'll see you later.
John Butte, everybody.